In the previous video, we mentioned that the age of a star, its main sequence lifetime, was related to what type of star it is, where it started out on the main sequence. And you might ask yourself, how could we possibly know that? How could we find a relationship between the age of a star and what type it is? Because how could we know how old a star is when we look up in the sky and we take the spectrum and we determine it's a type A star? How could we then know how old that star is, or anything about how long it's been alive or how long it will continue to be alive? If you think about it, humans have only been walking around for thousands of years. So how could we possibly know the ages of things that are minimum of millions of years and up to billions of years and hundreds of billions of years? How could we possibly know anything about that? Well, this is one of the things we can learn by looking at star clusters. And so in this video, we're going to talk about the importance of star clusters, what the types are, and how we can use them to age a star. Okay, so let's start out with what is a star cluster. A star cluster is a large collection of stars that are gravitationally bound to one another. So it's not that they just look like they're in the same spot in the sky. So you could look up in the sky and see a constellation and think, well, that must be a star cluster. Not necessarily. Those stars could be completely in different distances from us. Stars in a star cluster are all about the same distance. They're gravitationally bound. They're in orbit around one another. They have all evolved from the same large molecular cloud. Now, within that definition, there are three different types of star clusters. There are the globular star clusters, open clusters, and stellar associations. And the table here distinguishes the three. They're basically going from the biggest clusters down to the smallest clusters. So a globular cluster, 150, this is how many there are in the galaxy, 150 of them. There are thousands of open clusters, thousands of associations. When you look at the number of stars, 10 to the 4, so 10,000 to a million in a globular cluster. For an open cluster, 50 to 1,000 stars, and this is hundreds to 10,000s in the associations. Where would you find them? What their diameter is, how big the whole cluster is in terms of diameter and mass. The colors that you'll see, the globular clusters tend to be red, associations are blue, open can be red or blue. Differences in luminosity among them and their typical ages. So a globular cluster will be around for billions of years, open clusters a few 100 million to more than a billion, and then for associations up to about 10 million years. Okay, so those are the different types of star clusters that we will see. Okay, so here's an example of a globular cluster. So this is a globular cluster called Omega Centauri. It's about 16,000 light years away from us. At the center of these globular clusters, the stars are very, very close together. They're only a few light months apart. So think about the stars around the sun. Around the sun, the closest star is 4 light years away. Within a globular cluster, the stars are very, very close together. They're only a few light months apart. There's only about 150 known in the galaxy. And when you look at their center, you can see variations in the population of stars. So there's remember, thousands of stars in a cluster like this, and they come in all sorts of different sizes and brightness and colors. Now, overall, the cluster will appear red, but there are the different populations within the whole globular cluster. It's sort of like a mini galaxy. A globular cluster is like a mini galaxy of stars. Now, for an open cluster, the key is that there's a smaller number of stars, and you can count the individual stars when you look at the cluster in our night sky. So by open cluster, what we mean is they're countable. You can count them. And the most famous one in our night sky is the Pleiades, or which also known as the Seven Sisters. This is a nice image of the Pleiades star cluster. It's also the symbol for Subaru. So the Subaru constellation is the Pleiades constellation, as it's known in Japanese. There are 7 stars that are easily visible. When you look closer, there are thousands of stars there in actuality, but we can count 7 of them quite easily in our naked eye view. Okay, so this is a open cluster which looks much different than, say, the globular cluster here, which almost looks like a swarm of bees, and this is just a handful of them. Now, a stellar association, we have the constellation Orion. Now, as I mentioned before, constellations are not always star clusters, and it's not usually star clusters even. But it is true for Orion that they are part of the same group. They're close enough so that they have some gravitational influence on one another. And an association like this, like Orion, has between 5 and 50 hot, bright, young stars, and then thousands of lower mass stars that are less visible. So they formed from this molecular cloud. Then some of them, a small number of them, became very hot, bright stars, and then a lot of smaller stars formed as well. But the stars of Orion are part of the same association. Okay, so that was the introduction to what the types of star clusters are. Now we can see why they're important. And this gets into what you'll be doing in the lab this week. And it focuses on looking at a star cluster on an HR diagram. And pictured below, we have 3 different star clusters shown on HR diagrams. By looking at these diagrams, we can tell how old the star cluster is. I'll get into how we do that. But the important thing is, an HR diagram of a star cluster gives us the age of the cluster. And because all the stars formed at the same distance from us in the same molecular cloud, their ages should be about the same. Now there's going to be a margin of error there when a molecular cloud starts forming stars. The stars don't all turn on at exactly the same moment, but they all turn on within the same millions of years or so. What that means is that we can estimate the ages of those stars within millions of years or so. And that's pretty good when it comes to the life cycles of stars. That's a relatively small amount of time. So, how does it work? How does this picture tell us all of this information? Well, by looking at where the stars are on the diagram and the shape that the diagram takes, we can figure out how the stars have evolved up till that point. So let's take the picture here on the left. The higher mass stars form faster, right? So when you have a fairly young cluster, the higher mass stars will start to populate the zero-age main sequence first. So that will start to get populated. The lower mass stars are still in the process of contracting. They haven't officially become, they're still protostars. Now let's look at the second diagram. Once the low mass stars join the zero-age main sequence, the diagram starts to take a different shape. So these stars start to drift down here and find a place on the zero-age main sequence. This part of the diagram becomes populated. But then over even more time, we get it onto the third diagram. The higher mass stars, which formed faster, started burning brighter, joined the zero-age main sequence first. They have left the main sequence. They've left the diagram. And so there won't be stars populating this region anymore. Okay, so what we're looking here is a very young star cluster, sort of middle-aged star cluster, and an old star cluster. And the shape of this diagram immediately tells us something about the age. Now we can do more than that qualitative statement. If we specifically identify where the stars are turning off from the main sequence, what's called the turnoff point, that precise temperature, the temperature that occurs at, will be directly related to the age of the cluster. So again, we have the three diagrams here. This is a newborn star cluster. When all of the stars, so before any of the stars have left the main sequence, they're all on the zero age main sequence. So this is like a new star cluster that's just formed. So nothing has left the zero age main sequence. A little bit later, these stars are going to start leaving, and they're going to leave in the order in which they arrived. So the first stars to form will be these high temperature, high mass, high luminosity stars. They're going to form first. They're also going to leave first. So the stars will peel off of the main sequence in the order that they arrived. And that means that it'll peel from the top left down. And wherever this bend is the main sequence turnoff point. You can connect that to a temperature, and there's a direct relationship between that temperature that the star is turning off at and how many years the cluster has been around. So at this particular turnoff point, around 20,000 Kelvin, is 100 million years. So that means that a star at 20,000 Kelvin will live on the main sequence for 100 million years. So if it's now leaving the main sequence, that cluster is 100 million years old. So over here, the turnoff point is maybe like 6,000 Kelvin. Okay, well, a star that starts out at 6,000 Kelvin is going to live on the main sequence for 10 billion years. And so if the turnoff point is here, then the cluster is 10 billion years old. That's the idea of how this works and what you'll be using in the lab. You'll take two different star clusters, look at their HR diagrams, find their turnoff points, and that will tell you the age of the star clusters. By watching star clusters, we can't follow any one over time, but there are so many out there that we can see them at different stages in their evolution. So while we can't just put a video camera on a star cluster and watch it for billions of years, we can look in the sky and find a star cluster that's 1,000,000 years old, or 100 million years old, or 1,000,000,000 years old, or 5 billion years old, or 10 billion years old. And because of that, we can see how the different stars appear when they are a certain age. So we can look at a star, a type A star in a 100 million year old cluster, and compare it to a type A star in a 1 billion year old cluster. And so we can't follow the stars, any individual star, over its life cycle, but we can look up in the sky and find a star in any stage of its life cycle. And with star clusters, it's critically important that they're all at the same distance from us, so that we can look at them and their apparent magnitude will be directly correlated with their luminosity. And that means we can create an HR diagram for them. We can create an HR diagram for them because they're all at the same distance from us. We can use their apparent magnitude instead of their luminosities. And that's a very powerful tool. If it weren't for star clusters, we wouldn't really have a way to determine the way stars evolve over time, because we'd look up at stars and we wouldn't know how far away they are necessarily, and because they're not forming together in one place, we wouldn't be able to extract any information about their age. So star clusters are very, very important, and you'll see how they work in more detail in the lab this week.